The alpine wind cuts through the ridges of the Canadian Rockies like a blade, carrying whispers older than memory. In the summer of 1891, for men climbed into those ancient heights seeking glory and discovery. What they found instead was terror carved in stone. They spoke of giants, figures hewn from the mountain itself, that tore free from the rock and pursued them through the snow. Boulders fell with impossible precision. A campsite was obliterated. One man disappeared beneath tons of falling stone, his climbing rope severed as if by an invisible hand. The survivors returned pale, trembling, speaking in fragments of a nightmare that defied reason. The mountains, they said, were alive, and the giants had awakened. The story begins not with horror, but with ambition. In the late spring of 1891, a small expedition assembled in the frontier town of Banff, Alberta, for men bound by the lure of uncharted peaks and the promise of legacy. Their leader was a seasoned alpinist named Edward Whitmore, a man in his mid-40s with a graying beard and a reputation for meticulous planning. Beside him stood Thomas Creighton, a younger climber with a reckless streak and a hunger for recognition. The third was a guide named Samuel Bridger, a quiet Metis tracker who knew the mountains better than any white man. The fourth was a physician and amateur geologist, Dr. Alastair Fenton, who carried notebooks filled with sketches and theories about the geological oddities of the region. Their goal was simple: to summit an unnamed peak deep in the Selkirk Range, a jagged spire of granite and ice that local indigenous peoples referred to only in passing, and never without a tone of unease. The mountain had no English name. The Shawepam and Tanaxa peoples who traversed the lower valleys avoided it. When pressed, they spoke of it as a place where the earth remembered old angers, where stone held the shape of forgotten things. The expedition departed on June 12, 1891. For the first 3 days, the journey was uneventful. They traveled through dense coniferous forests, crossing icy streams and navigating narrow game trails. The weather held. The men were in good spirits. Bridger led them with calm efficiency, pointing out landmarks, reading the land with an intuition born from generations of knowledge. At night, they camped beneath towering pines, their fires small and respectful against the immensity of the wilderness. But as they climbed higher, the forest thinned. The trees became twisted, their trunks bent at unnatural angles. The ground grew rocky and sparse, and the mountain itself began to reveal its face, a towering wall of gray stone marked with deep vertical grooves and fractures. Dr. Fenton was the first to notice the patterns. He stopped often, sketching the rock formations, tracing the lines with a kind of reverent curiosity. "These aren't natural striations," he said on the fourth day, his voice edged with excitement. "They're too uniform, too deliberate." Whitmore dismissed the observation. "Erosion takes strange forms at altitude," he replied. But Fenton shook his head, unconvinced. Bridger said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the stone. By the 5th day, they reached the base of the peak. The final approach would require technical climbing, ropes, anchors, and a careful ascent through a labyrinth of cliffs and couloirs. They established a base camp in a shallow depression sheltered by a ring of boulders. The site was oddly symmetrical, the stones arranged in a rough circle, as if placed by intention rather than chance. Creighton joked about ancient druids. No one laughed. That night, the wind changed. It howled through the heights with a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it brought dreams. Whitmore dreamed of hands pressing against stone from the inside. Creighton dreamed of voices in a language he could not name. Fenton woke 3 times, convinced he heard footsteps circling the camp. Bridger did not sleep at all. He sat with his back to the fire, staring up at the mountain, his rifle across his knees. At dawn, they began to climb. The ascent was grueling. The rock was sharp and unforgiving, the handholds few and treacherous. They moved in silence, conserving breath, focusing on the rhythm of movement. Reach, test, pull, step. Hours passed. The sun climbed with them, casting long shadows across the cliffs. And it was in those shadows that Creighton first saw it, a shape carved into the mountainside. He stopped, clinging to the rock, his heart pounding. "Whitmore," he called. "Look." The others followed his gaze. There, Embedded in the stone face about 30 feet to their left was the unmistakable outline of a human figure. It was massive, easily 20 feet tall, its body rendered in crude but deliberate relief. The arms were raised, the head tilted back, the mouth open as if in a silent roar. "My God!" Fenton whispered. Bridger's voice was flat. "We should go back." Whitmore hesitated. For a long moment, he stared at the stone figure, his jaw tight. Then he shook his head. "It's just a carving. Some old indigenous art. We're not turning back now." They continued climbing. But the discovery had changed something. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. And as they moved higher, they began to see more figures. Dozens of them, carved into every surface. Some were crude outlines. Others were detailed, with faces and fingers and expressions frozen in anguish or rage. They lined the cliffs like sentinels, watching, waiting. Dr. Fenton could no longer contain his excitement. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice trembling. "These could be thousands of years old. A lost civilization, a forgotten culture." But Bridger was looking at the carvings differently. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "These aren't art," he said quietly. "These are warnings." No one replied. By midday, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking a vertical chasm. The summit was within reach. Perhaps 3 more hours of climbing. They paused to rest, drinking water, checking their gear. The wind had died. The silence was absolute. And then, without warning, a sound echoed across the mountain. A grinding, scraping noise, like stone dragging against stone. The men froze. The sound came again, louder now, reverberating through the cliffs. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Creighton's face went white. Fenton gripped his rope. Whitmore scanned the rock face, his eyes darting. "What the hell is that?" Creighton hissed. Bridger didn't answer. He was staring at one of the carved figures, a massive shape directly above them, its arms outstretched, its head tilted as if listening. And then, impossibly, horribly, the figure moved. At first, none of them believed what they were seeing. The mind rejects impossibility. It searches for rational explanations, a trick of light, a shifting shadow, a hallucination born from altitude and exhaustion. But the grinding sound came again, and this time was accompanied by the unmistakable crack of splitting rock. The carved figure, the 20-foot giant etched into the mountain, was no longer flush with the stone. Its outline had deepened, its edges had separated, and as the 4 men watched in frozen horror, the figure began to peel away from the cliff face. Dust and debris tumbled down. The scraping grew louder, more insistent. And then, with a sound like thunder breaking loose, the stone giant tore free. It fell forward, pivoting on some unseen axis, and landed on a ledge with concussive impact that shook the mountain. The men screamed. Bridger lunged backward, nearly tumbling over the edge. Whitmore grabbed him, hauling him to safety. Fenton dropped his notebook. Creighton's rope slipped from his hands. The giant stood. It was not a statue. It was not an illusion. It was stone given shape and weight and terrible, deliberate motion. Its body was rough-hewn, its surface cracked and weathered, but it moved with fluidity that defied its material form. Its head turned toward them, slow and grinding, and though it had no eyes, only shallow depressions where eyes should have been, they felt its gaze. "Run," Bridger said. They ran. The ledge was narrow, the descent treacherous, but terror overrode caution. They scrambled down the rock face, their hands slipping on loose stone, their lungs burning. Behind them, the grinding continued. The giant was moving, not quickly, but with relentless, inevitable purpose. Its footsteps shook the mountain. Each step sent cracks spiderwebbing through the stone. And then, from above, another sound, another scraping, another shape tearing free. Whitmore risked a glance upward and saw the nightmare multiply. 3 more figures were detaching from the cliffs, massive humanoid forms carved in crude, ancient relief. They moved in unison, their stone limbs creaking, their weight sending avalanches of rubble cascading down the mountain. "They're all waking up." Fenton shouted, his voice breaking. The men descended in a blind panic, abandoning technique, relying on instinct and luck. Creighton lost his footing and slid 20 feet before catching himself on an outcrop. Bridger's rope snagged on a jagged spur, and he had to cut it loose with his knife. Whitmore's hands were bleeding, torn by the sharp rock. Fenton was muttering prayers under his breath, his face pale and slick with sweat. And still the giants came. They reached the base of the cliff and sprinted toward the camp. The ground shook beneath them. Boulders, massive, impossibly large boulders, began to roll down the mountainside. Not randomly, not chaotically, but with precision, as if aimed. One boulder smashed into the ground mere feet from Creighton, sending up a spray of dirt and shattered stone. Another crashed through a cluster of trees, splintering trunks like matchsticks. The men scattered, diving for cover, scrambling over broken ground. "The camp!" Whitmore shouted. "Get to the camp." But when they reached the base camp, they found only ruin. The ring of boulders that had sheltered their tents was gone, not scattered, but rearranged. The stones had been moved, stacked, piled into rough formations that resembled crude altars or cairns. The tents were shredded. The supplies were crushed. The fire pit was buried beneath a mound of rubble, and written in the dirt, traced by something large and deliberate, was a symbol, a spiral within a circle, repeated 3 times. "What the hell is this?" Creighton's voice was high, panicked. Bridger's face was ashen. "It's a boundary, a warning. We crossed something we shouldn't have." Another grinding sound echoed from above. The giants were descending. "We can't stay here," Whitmore said, his voice tight. "We have to move. Now." They grabbed what they could, a few ropes, a canteen, a knife, and fled into the narrow ravine that led down the mountain. The walls of the ravine were steep and close, the floor littered with loose stone. It was a defensible position, but also a trap. If the giants followed, there would be no escape. They didn't have to wait long. The grinding sound grew louder. Shadows fell across the ravine entrance. And then, one by one, the stone giants appeared. They moved slowly, their massive forms filling the narrow space. They did not speak. They did not roar. They simply advanced, their footsteps shaking the earth, their presence suffocating. The men pressed deeper into the ravine, their backs against the cold stone, their options running out. "We have to fight," Creighton said, his voice desperate. "How?" Fenton snapped. "They're made of stone. Then we hide," Bridger said. He pointed to a narrow crevasse in the ravine wall, a crack barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. "In there. Now." They didn't argue. One by one, they wedged themselves into crevasse, pressing their bodies into the darkness, holding their breath. The stone giants reached the ravine entrance and stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. And then the boulders began to fall. Not randomly, deliberately. Massive stones tumbled down from above, crashing into the ravine, sealing the entrance, burying the path they had taken. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of grinding, smashing, splintering rock. The men huddled in the crevasse, their hands over their ears, their eyes squeezed shut, praying the walls would hold. And then, in the chaos, Creighton screamed. The scream cut through the roar of falling stone like a knife through flesh. The men turned toward the sound, their eyes wide with panic. Thomas Creighton was at the rear of the crevasse, his body half wedged into the narrow opening, his face twisted in terror. His climbing rope, the one he had coiled and slung over his shoulder, was pulled taut, stretched out crevasse, and into the open ravine beyond. Something was pulling him. "Help me!" he shrieked, clawing at the rock, his fingers scraping uselessly against the stone. "It's got me. It's—" Whitmore lunged forward, grabbing Creighton's arm, bracing his feet against the crevasse walls. Bridger joined him, gripping Creighton's coat, pulling with all his strength. But the force on the other end of the rope was immense, inhuman. The rope groaned under the tension, fibers splitting, twisting. "Cut it!" Fenton shouted. "Cut the rope." "I can't reach it." Creighton gasped, his body sliding backward inch by inch despite the men's efforts. His eyes were wild, darting, locked on something just beyond the crevasse entrance. Oh God, it's looking at me. And then the rope snapped, not frayed, not torn, severed clean as if by a blade. The cut end whipped back into the crevasse, striking Whitmore across the face. And Thomas Creighton, still screaming, was yanked backward out of the narrow crack and into the ravine beyond. The sound of impact was sickening, a wet crunch of bone and stone. And then silence. For a long moment, the three remaining men didn't move. They stared at the empty space where Creighton had been, their breath coming in ragged gasps, their minds refusing to process what had just happened. Outside, the grinding of the stone giants continued, but it was quieter now, slower, almost methodical. "We have to go after him," Fenton whispered, his voice hollow. "He's dead," Bridger said flatly. "You don't know that." "I know." Bridger's face was hard, his eyes dark. "And if we go out there, we're dead too." Whitmore said nothing. His hand was pressed against the rock wall, his knuckles white, his breathing shallow. Blood trickled from the cut on his cheek, where the rope had struck him. He was a leader. He had brought them here. And now one of his men was gone. They waited in the crevasse for what felt like hours, though it could have been minutes. The sound outside gradually faded, the grinding footsteps, the falling boulders, the oppressive weight of presence. The mountain grew quiet again, but it was not a comforting silence. It was a silence of something watching, waiting. Finally, when the last echoes had died, Bridger edged toward the crevasse entrance and peered out. The ravine was unrecognizable. What had been a clear path was now a chaotic jumble of massive boulders and broken rock. The entrance was nearly sealed. And there, half buried beneath a pile of stones, was Thomas Creighton, or what was left of him. His body was crushed, his limbs twisted at impossible angles. His face was turned toward the sky, his eyes wide and lifeless. And coiled beside him, severed clean through the middle, was his climbing rope. The cut end was smooth, too smooth, not frayed by tension or worn by abrasion. Sliced, but there was no blade, no tool, nothing that could have made that cut. "We need to move," Bridger said quietly. "Now." They didn't bury Creighton. There was no time, no tools, and no point. The mountain had already claimed him. They squeezed out of the crevasse one by one, moving carefully over the unstable rubble, their eyes scanning the cliffs above. The carved figures were still there, dozens of them lining the rock face, but they were motionless now, flush with the stone, as if they had never moved at all. Dr. Fenton stared at them, his face pale, his hands trembling. "How is this possible?" he whispered. "Stone doesn't move. It doesn't think. It doesn't." "It does here," Bridger interrupted. "And we need to leave before it does again." They descended as quickly as they dared, abandoning the planned route, taking a more direct path down the mountainside. The terrain was brutal. Loose scree, sheer drops, tangled undergrowth, but fear drove them forward. They didn't stop. They didn't rest. They barely spoke. Every sound made them flinch. Every shadow made them turn. By nightfall, they had reached the treeline. The twisted pines closed around them, offering a semblance of shelter. They made camp without fire, huddling together in the darkness, too afraid to sleep. Above them, the mountain loomed, a black silhouette against the stars. And somewhere in those heights, the giants waited. Fenton broke the silence first. "We have to report this," he said. "We have to tell someone what we saw." "Who's going to believe us?" Whitmore replied bitterly. "A man crushed by falling rocks. Climbers hallucinating from altitude sickness. That's what they'll say. But the rope proves nothing." Bridger was staring up at the mountain, his expression unreadable. "The people who live here have always known," he said quietly. "They don't go near that peak. They don't speak its name. They know what's up there." "What is up there?" Fenton asked. Bridger didn't answer for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reverent. "Something old, older than us, older than the trees, maybe older than the mountain itself. The elders say that long ago, before the white men came, before even our ancestors walked this land, there were others, beings made of stone and earth. They shaped the mountains. They carved the valleys. And when their time ended, they went to sleep. But they didn't die. They just waited. For what? Whitmore asked. For someone to wake them. The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. None of them slept that night. They sat in silence, watching the mountain, waiting for dawn. And when the sun finally rose, pale and weak through the trees, they packed what little they had and continued their descent. It took them 2 more days to reach Banff. They arrived gaunt, hollow-eyed, their clothes torn and bloodied. They spoke little. When questioned, Whitmore filed a brief report. Climbing accident, 1 fatality, body unrecoverable. The authorities accepted the explanation. Accidents were common in the mountains. Men died. It was the nature of the wilderness. But the 3 survivors knew the truth, and it haunted them. Dr. Alastair Fenton never returned to the mountains. He left Canada within a month and settled in England, where he abandoned geology and turned to writing strange, unsettling fiction about ancient things buried in the earth. He died in 1903, alone, his final manuscript unfinished. Samuel Bridger disappeared into the wilderness. Some say he went back to his people. Others say he went back to Mountain, seeking answers or atonement. No one knows for certain. He was never seen again. Edward Whitmore lived the longest. He returned to climbing, but never to the Selkirks. He told the story only once in 1910, to a journalist who dismissed it as the ramblings of a traumatized old man. The article was never published. Whitmore died in 1921, and his journals were lost. But the mountain remains, and the giants sleep within it. In the years following the 1891 expedition, the story of the stone giants faded into obscurity. It became a footnote, a whisper, a campfire tale told in the lodges of Banff to thrill tourists. But among certain circles, academics, mountaineers, cryptozoologists, and those drawn to the strange and unexplained, the incident refused to die. Questions lingered. Had Edward Whitmore and his companions truly witnessed the impossible? Or had altitude, exhaustion, and tragedy conspired to create a shared delusion? The first serious investigation came in 1897, 6 years after the original expedition. A British anthropologist named Dr. Colin Harrow, intrigued by scattered references to the incident in obscure climbing journals, traveled to Banff with the intention of interviewing survivors. He managed to locate Edward Whitmore, who was by then working as a surveyor in Calgary. Whitmore was reluctant to speak, but Harrow was persistent. Over the course of several meetings, Whitmore recounted the expedition in painstaking detail. Harrow took extensive notes. He sketched diagrams. He pressed for specifics: the location of the peak, the appearance of the carvings, the precise nature of the giants' movements. Whitmore complied, but his hands shook as he spoke. "You won't find proof," he said. "The mountain doesn't give up its secrets." Harrow ignored the warning. In the summer of 1898, he organized his own expedition to the unnamed peak. He brought with him a team of 3, a photographer, a surveyor, and a mountaineering guide. They reached the base of the mountain without incident, but when they began the ascent, things went wrong. The weather turned violent. Storms that had not been forecasted swept through the heights. Equipment was lost. The photographer's camera was destroyed in a rock slide, and the guide, an experienced alpinist named John Merrick, refused to continue. "Something's wrong with this place," he said. "The rock doesn't feel right. The air doesn't move right. We need to leave." Harrow insisted on pressing forward, but the rest of the team refused. They descended in defeat. Harrow published a brief account of the attempt in the Geographical Society journal, but it was buried in the back pages and largely ignored. He never returned to the mountain. In his private correspondence, later discovered in an archive in London, he admitted, "I felt watched. Every step of the climb, I felt eyes on me, not human eyes, stone eyes." The next significant attempt came nearly 30 years later. In 1926, a Canadian geologist named Arthur Drummond led a scientific survey of the Selkirk Range. Drummond was a skeptic, a man of science who dismissed folklore and superstition. But he had read Harrow's account and was curious about the carvings described by Whitmore. If ancient petroglyphs existed at such high altitudes, They would be of significant archaeological value. He assembled a small team and set out in late June. Drummond's expedition succeeded where Harrow's had failed. They reached the peak. They documented the site. And they found the carvings. Dozens of them, exactly as Whitmore had described. Massive humanoid figures etched into the cliffs, their forms crude but deliberate, their expressions frozen in silent anguish. Drummond photographed them, measured them, took detailed notes. He was ecstatic. This was a major discovery. But then, on the third night of their encampment, something happened. Drummond's journal, recovered later, provides a chilling account. June 24th, 1926, 2:47 a.m. Woken by a sound unlike anything I have heard. A grinding, as if the mountain itself were shifting. The men are awake, frightened. We have checked the camp. Nothing is disturbed. But the sound continues. It seems to come from the cliffs. I have instructed the team to prepare for immediate descent at first light. I do not understand what is happening, but I no longer feel safe here. They left at dawn, but as they descended, one of the team members, a young assistant named Peter Hollis, looked back and saw something that stopped him cold. One of the carved figures, a massive shape near the summit, appeared different. Its arms, which had been raised in the photographs taken the previous day, were now lowered. Its head, which had been tilted back, was now facing forward. Hollis called out to Drummond, but Drummond dismissed it. "Trick of the light," he said. "Angle of perspective." But Hollis insisted. He produced the photographs. And when they compared the images, the discrepancy was undeniable. The figure had moved. Drummond confiscated the photographs. He forbade Hollis from speaking about it. The official report, published in 1927, made no mention of movement or anomalies. It described the carvings as remarkable examples of pre-contact indigenous art, likely created between 500 and 1,000 years ago. The photographs were never released to the public. Drummond retired in 1930 and died in 1934. The photographs, if they still exist, have never been found, but rumors persisted. Climbers who ventured near the peak in the decades that followed reported strange occurrences. Equipment vanishing, ropes severed without explanation, the sensation of being watched. In 1952, a climbing party reported seeing a massive figure moving on the cliffs at dusk. They described it as impossibly large, moving in a way that defied physics. The report was dismissed as a hoax. In 1973, a team from the University of British Columbia attempted to conduct a comprehensive archaeological survey of the site. They were turned back by a sudden and inexplicable rockslide that destroyed much of their equipment. The lead researcher, Dr. Maria Solis, later wrote in her personal notes, "I have climbed mountains on 3 continents. I have never felt fear like I felt on that peak. It was not the danger of falling or injury. It was a fear of being watched by something that did not want us there. Modern attempts to investigate the site have been similarly thwarted. The mountain is remote, difficult to access, and notoriously dangerous. Permits are hard to obtain. The weather is unpredictable, and those who do reach the peak rarely stay long. The carvings remain silent and inscrutable, their origins and purpose unknown. But the most compelling evidence, the severed rope from Thomas Creighton's death, was never recovered. It was left on the mountain, buried beneath the rubble. If it still exists, it lies somewhere in those heights, a silent testament to the impossible. The story of the 1891 stone giants has, over the decades, attracted a wide spectrum of interpretations. Believers, skeptics, scientists, and storytellers have all weighed in, each attempting to impose order on a narrative that resists easy explanation. What follows is a survey of the most prominent theories, some grounded in geology and psychology, others rooted in folklore and the paranormal. The geological explanation, the most widely accepted scientific theory, attributes the entire incident to a combination of natural phenomena and psychological factors. Dr. Helena Cartwright, a geomorphologist at the University of Alberta, has written extensively on the subject. Her 2004 paper, Rockfall, Pareidolia, and the 1891 Selkirk Incident, argues that the climbers encountered a massive and sudden rockslide triggered by seismic activity or thermal expansion. The giants, she suggests, were large sections of cliff face that detached and tumbled downward, their movements exaggerated and anthropomorphized by terrified, oxygen-deprived minds. At high altitudes, the human brain is deprived of oxygen, leading to hallucinations, paranoia, and distorted perception, Cartwright writes. The carvings described by Whitmore were likely natural erosion patterns or indigenous petroglyphs misinterpreted under stress. The movement of the stone figures was almost certainly a combination of rockfall and pareidolia, the tendency to see faces and figures in random shapes. The severed rope, in this interpretation, was simply worn through by friction against sharp rock during the chaos of the rock slide. The survivors, traumatized and guilt-ridden over Creighton's death, constructed a narrative that absolved them of responsibility and transformed a tragic accident into a supernatural encounter. This explanation is tidy, rational, and for many, satisfying. But it has its critics. The anomaly problem. Dr. Marcus Levi, a physicist and anomalous phenomena researcher, has challenged Cartwright's conclusions. In a 2011 rebuttal, he points to several inconsistencies that the geological theory fails to address. First, the carvings. Indigenous petroglyphs are common in the region, but they are almost always found at lower elevations near water sources and travel routes, not at remote, nearly inaccessible alpine peaks. The Shawepum and Tanaxa oral traditions contain no references to carving figures at such heights. If the carvings were made by humans, who made them and why? Second, the precision of the rockfall. The boulders that pursued the climbers did not fall randomly. They rolled with apparent directionality, as if guided. Whitmore's account describes boulders aiming for the men, altering course mid-descent. While rock slides can be chaotic, the degree of precision describes strange credulity. Third, and most troubling, is the severed rope. Levi notes that climbing ropes of the 1890s, while not as durable as modern synthetic fibers, were still remarkably strong. A rope under tension would fray, not sever cleanly. To cut cleanly through a rope under load requires a sharp blade and significant force. What could have made that cut? Levi stops short of proposing a definitive alternative explanation, but he concludes, we must remain open to the possibility that the 1891 incident involved phenomena outside our current understanding of geology and physics. The cryptid hypothesis. In cryptozoological circles, the stone giants of 1891 are frequently cited as evidence of a broader, more unsettling phenomenon, the existence of sentient, non-biological entities. Proponents of this theory argue that the giants were not animated stone, but rather a form of Earth-based life form, a geobiological entity composed of mineral matter capable of movement and possibly even thought. This idea, while fringe, is not without precedent. Folklore from around the world is rich with tales of living stone. The Jewish golem, the Greek automaton telos, the Norse Dvergr who dwell within mountains. Indigenous traditions across North America speak of stone people or rock beings who predate human arrival. The Hopi speak of the Kachina, spirits tied to the land. The Inuit tell of the Inukshuk, stone markers that some legends claim can walk. Could these stories be cultural memories of actual encounters with non-human intelligences? The theory is speculative, controversial, and largely dismissed by mainstream science. But it persists. And for those who believe the 1891 incident is not an isolated anomaly, but part of a pattern, the psychological interpretation, a more recent theory, proposed by Dr. Alan Richter, a clinical psychologist specializing in trauma, suggests that the entire event was a shared psychogenic episode, a form of mass hysteria induced by extreme stress. Richter points to the expedition's circumstances: isolation, physical exhaustion, oxygen deprivation, and the sudden, violent death of a companion. Under such conditions, he argues, the human mind is capable of constructing elaborate, shared delusions. The brain, when pushed to its limits, seeks patterns and explanations, Richter writes. The survivors of the 1891 expedition were not lying. They genuinely believed they saw stone giants. But belief is not the same as reality. What they experienced was a collective psychological break, a defensive mechanism that allowed them to process an unbearable trauma. This theory has gained traction in academic circles, but it, too, has its weaknesses. Shared delusions typically require prolonged exposure and social reinforcement. The climbers were isolated under acute stress and had little time to construct a coherent shared narrative before the incident occurred. Moreover, Richter's theory does not account for physical evidence. The destroyed camp, the rearranged stones, the severed rope, the indigenous perspective. Perhaps the most overlooked voices in the debate are those of the indigenous peoples who have lived in the shadow of the Selkirk Range for millennia. When consulted, and they are rarely consulted, Shawepam and Tanaxa elders offer a different interpretation. They do not debate the reality of the giants. They accept it. The mountains, they say, are alive, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal one. The stone remembers, the stone watches, and the stone does not forgive trespass. In a 2015 interview with ethnographer Drive Sarah Lorne, a Shawepam elder named Thomas Yellowboard spoke about the peak. Our grandparents told us not to go there. That place belongs to the old ones, the ones who were here before us, before anyone. You go there, you're walking on sacred ground, and sacred ground defends itself. When asked if he believed the giant were real, Yellowboard smiled. Belief is a white man's word. We don't believe. We know. This perspective, grounded in oral tradition and lived experience, is difficult for Western science to engage with. It operates on a different epistemological framework, one that does not separate the physical from the spiritual, the natural from the supernatural. But it is consistent, and it has endured. The truth, if there is a truth, remains elusive. The mountain keeps its secrets, and the giants carved or awakened wait in silence. The question that haunts every investigator, every skeptic, every believer, is this: what really happened on that mountain in 1891? Was it a tragic accident misremembered to the fog of trauma? A genuine encounter with the impossible? Or something stranger still? A convergence of natural forces, human psychology, and ancient mysteries that defies simple categorization? To approach an answer, we must return to the physical evidence and the testimony of the survivors. Despite the passage of time and the loss of key documents, certain facts remain undisputed. 4 men climbed an unnamed peak in the Selkirk Range. 1 man died. The 3 survivors returned with a story that was consistent across retellings, even decades later. And the mountain itself, remains a place of unease, avoided by locals and marked by a history of inexplicable incidents. Let us examine the possibilities. Scenario 1, the rational collapse. Assume, for a moment, that there were no giants, no living stone, only rock and gravity and human error. The carvings were real, indigenous petroglyphs or natural erosion patterns misinterpreted by exhausted climbers. The movement was a rock slide, triggered by unstable conditions. The severed rope was a tragic fluke, worn through by friction. Creighton's death, while horrific, was an accident. The survivors, traumatized and guilt-ridden, construct a narrative to make sense of the senseless. This explanation is clean. It aligns with known science. It requires no leaps of faith, but it struggles under scrutiny. Whitmore, Bridger, and Fenton were not amateurs. They were experienced in the mountains, familiar with rock slides and the effects of altitude. They knew what a collapsing cliff looked like. They knew what exhaustion felt like. And yet, independently and consistently, they described something else, something deliberate, something aware. Moreover, the precision of the events, the timing, the directionality, the rearrangement of the campsite strains the boundaries of coincidence. Rock slides are chaotic. They do not arrange stones in patterns. They do not sever ropes cleanly. They do not wait. Scenario 2, the living mountain. Assume, instead, that the survivors were telling the truth as they perceived it. The giants were real. Stone impossibly came to life. The mountain itself was alive, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal, sentient sense. This explanation aligns with the testimony. It accounts with precision the intelligence, the sense of presence, but it requires us to accept the existence of phenomena that defy our understanding of physics, biology, and reality itself. Is such a thing possible? In the strictest scientific sense, no. Stone is inert. It does not move without external force. It does not think. It does not respond. But science is a map, not the territory. And maps have edges. There are phenomena, quantum entanglement ball lightning, rogue waves, that were once dismissed as impossible and are now accepted as real. Could the stone giants be another such phenomenon? A form of matter or energy that we do not yet understand. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a materials physicist at Kyoto University, has speculated cautiously about non-biological sentience in certain crystalline structures. In a controversial 2018 paper, she proposed that under specific conditions, electromagnetic fields, seismic resonance, piezoelectric effects, certain geological formations might exhibit behaviors resembling responsiveness or even rudimentary awareness. She stops short claiming that stone can wake up, but she leaves the door open. We do not fully understand the range of possible states that matter can occupy. To dismiss the unknown is to close the door on discovery. Scenario 3, the in-between. Perhaps the truth lies not in choosing between rational and supernatural, but in recognizing that the categories themselves are false. The anthropologist Dr. Sarah Lauren has argued that Western epistemology, the way we define real and unreal, is too rigid to accommodate phenomena that exist in liminal spaces. Indigenous knowledge systems do not separate the physical from the spiritual, she writes. They understand that some places, some beings, exist on a spectrum that our language cannot capture. The stone giants may not be alive in the biological sense, nor dead in the inert sense. They may be something else, something we have no words for. This interpretation resonates with the testimony of Samuel Bridger, the Metis guide who survived the expedition. In his final known interview, conducted in 1909 by a priest in a remote mission, Bridger said, "The mountain is not alive the way you think of alive, but it is not dead either. It remembers. And when you wake it, it remembers you. What does it mean for stone to remember? What does it mean for a place to hold consciousness, not as a metaphor, but as a fact?" These are questions that sit uneasily at the intersection of science, philosophy, and spirituality. And they are questions that the 1891 incident forces us to confront. The severed rope, a clue. If any single piece of evidence could resolve the mystery, it would be Thomas Creighton's rope. A clean cut through a tension rope is not easily explained by natural forces. If the rope could be recovered and analyzed with modern forensic techniques, microscopy, material analysis, stress testing, it might provide a definitive answer. Was it frayed? Sliced? Crushed? Each possibility points to a different conclusion. But the rope is gone, buried somewhere on that mountain. And the mountain does not give up its secrets easily. The pattern of recurrence. One of the most compelling aspects of the 1891 incident is that it is not unique. Reports of similar phenomena, stone figures moving, boulders rolling with unnatural precision, climbers feeling watched, continue to emerge in the Selkirk Range and other remote mountain regions. In 2003, a hiking party in the Canadian Rockies reported seeing a massive humanoid shape detach from a cliff face and walk into a crevasse. In 2017, a climber in the Andes photographed what appeared to be a carved figure that had shifted position between two ascents. These incidents are dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications, but the pattern persists. Could there be a geological or atmospheric phenomenon, unknown to science, that creates these effects? A form of seismic activity that causes cliffs to fracture in ways that mimic movement? An optical illusion caused by specific lighting conditions? Or is something else at work? Something older, stranger, and more deliberate? We do not know. We may never know. But the question remains, hanging over the mountains like a shadow. And those who climb into those heights carry it with them. There's a peculiar gravity to mysteries that refuse resolution. They sit in the mind like stones, cold, heavy, immovable. The 1891 expedition into the Selkirk Range is one such mystery. It defies closure. It resists explanation. And perhaps, in that resistance, it reveals something essential about the limits of human understanding and the hubris of certainty. Edward Whitmore, Samuel Bridger, and Dr. Alastair Fenton returned from the mountain changed. They did not speak of their experience lightly. They did not seek fame or profit from it. They lived with what they had seen in the way one lives with a scar. Quietly, privately, aware that the world would not believe them, that language itself was insufficient to convey the truth. And when they spoke, it was with the weight of men who had looked into the face of the inexplicable and survived. Dr. Fenton, in his later writings, abandoned the rigid empiricism of geology. His fiction, strange, surreal, unsettling, explored themes of sentient landscapes, ancient intelligences, and the terror of realizing that the earth beneath our feet is not passive, not inert, but aware. He wrote of places that remember, of stone that dreams. His work was dismissed as the product of mind unmoored by trauma. But those who read it felt something, a recognition, a shiver, a sense that he was not inventing, but remembering. Samuel Bridger disappeared into the wilderness. Some say he returned to his people, seeking solace in traditions that understood what Western science could not. Others say he went back to the mountain, not to conquer it, but to make peace with it. There are stories, unverified, whispered, that Bridger lived out his final years as a hermit in the high country, tending to the land, speaking to the stone. Whether he found answers, or simply learned to live with questions, no one knows. Edward Whitmore lived longest, and perhaps suffered most. He continued climbing, but avoided the Selkirks. He never spoke publicly about the expedition after 1910. But his private journals, fragment of which survived, reveal a man haunted by guilt and doubt. "I brought them there," he wrote in 1915. "I led them into a place we did not understand. And Creighton paid the price. I wonder, sometimes, if the mountain was angry, or if it was simply indifferent. I do not know which is worse." In his final years, Whitmore became reclusive. He kept maps of the Selkirk Range on his walls, studying them obsessively, marking locations, tracing routes. It is said that he was planning one final expedition, back to the unnamed peak, back to the site of the encounter. He died before he could make the journey. The maps were burned by his family, who found them disturbing. What were they looking for, these three men? Vindication? Proof? Understanding? Or were they simply trying to make sense of an experience that shattered their conception of reality? We cannot know. The dead keep their secrets as well as the mountains. The mountain today, the unnamed peak of the 1891 incident has, over the years, been absorbed into the Canadian National Park System. It is accessible, technically, though few attempt to climb. The approach is difficult, the weather unpredictable, and the mountain has a reputation, not an official reputation. Park rangers do not speak of giants or haunted stone, but among climbers, guides, and locals, the knowledge persists. This is a place to be careful, a place to respect, a place that does not forgive carelessness. The carvings remain. Some have been documented by archaeologists and are considered to be of significant cultural and historical value. They are attributed to pre-contact indigenous peoples, dated somewhere between 800 and 1200 CE. Their purpose is unknown. They depict humanoid figures, some in postures of worship or supplication, others in postures of anguish or rage. There is debate about their meaning. Are they religious icons, territorial markers, warnings? No one has reported seeing the carvings move. Not recently, not in a way that has been documented and verified. But there are stories. A climber in 1989 claimed that one of the figures wasn't where it was supposed to be. A photographer in 2006 insisted that the expression on a carved face had changed between two visits. These accounts are dismissed. Perspective, memory, suggestion. But they persist. And the mountain, silent and immovable, offers no answers. The legacy of the impossible. The 1891 incident occupies a strange space in the landscape of the unexplained. It is not famous like Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. It does not inspire television specials or viral internet debates. It is a quiet mystery, known to a small circle of researchers, climbers, and enthusiasts of strange. But it endures. And it endures because it touches something deep, a primal unease about the world we think we know. We tell ourselves that we understand the earth. We map it, measure it, name it. We build on it, dig into it, claim it. But every so often, the earth reminds us that we are guests, not masters, that there are places we do not understand, that stone, silent and ancient, holds memories we cannot access, and that some things, once awakened, do not sleep again. The story of the stone giants is, ultimately, a story about limits, the limits of knowledge, the limits of control, the limits of language to convey experience. It is a story that refuses to be explained away, that resists the tidy resolution we crave, and perhaps that is its power. In a world of answers, it remains a question. In a landscape of certainty, it is a shadow. The final word. There is no final word. The mountain is still there. The carvings are still there. And somewhere buried beneath rubble and time, Thomas Creighton's severed rope lies waiting for someone to find it, waiting for the truth to be revealed, waiting, perhaps, for the mountain to speak again. But the mountain does not speak. It only watches. And those who climb into its heights carry with them the knowledge that they are not alone, that the stone remembers, that the giants, carved or awakened, wait in silence. And in that silence, there is a warning, a reminder, a truth older than words. Some places do not belong to us, and some things should not be woken,